This is a first of a series of 4 of these forums we're going to be holding throughout the community. Today, the central focus of it is the general fund impact. While the center does have the potential to be transformative, it's been pretty clear that our marching orders are to make sure there's not a nickel of taxpayer money involved. So we'll ask a series of questions and try to better understand how it's being framed and where that stands and what we need to do to make sure that is indeed the case. Just for the record, the next one of these will be on the job creation aspects, March 17th at the South LA Constituent Center in South Vermont Avenue. 7th, I'm sorry. We will hold a third one on the EIR, traffic, and some of those issues on March 8th downtown. And then that same afternoon on the impact on our convention, event center, and tourism business in Century City. So we welcome any of you to attend any or all of those.
Development Officer for AEG. As Dan alluded to, we certainly foresee significant positive impacts to the city and the general fund here, and Sean D. will momentarily speak in some more detail about some of those. But I want to start by focusing on a core principle that has really been the focus for us as we develop the proposal that we submitted and as we move forward in the negotiations here, which is we understand that it is critical that this transaction not put the city, the general fund, and the taxpayers at risk here. We've come to understand over a course of months, and in fact years, as we've worked closely with the city of Los Angeles, first on the Staples Center transaction and then LA Live, and as we've had some early discussions about this project, that we couldn't put forth any sort of proposal here that would pose a financial risk and would threaten to divert funds from the general fund in a way that could put other critical city services at risk. So that principle has really guided us and is one that we've tried to remain true to, and we intend to stick with as we proceed here. It's that has guided the general framework, which I'll give a quick synopsis of. We submitted a couple weeks ago a proposal to the CLA and the CAO, and our expectation in the coming weeks is that we'll have some further discussions and get into more detail about a lot of important issues that weren't necessarily addressed in the proposal. But the general framework here is that the event center will be entirely privately financed. So the roughly $1 billion plus stadium will be something that the city and the general fund will have absolutely no risk on. It'll be entirely privately financed by the developer of the project. The aspect of the project that does involve the public sector involvement is the replacement of the West Hall and the construction of some parking structures that would be ancillary to that. That cost is estimated at roughly $300 to $350 million, and our proposal does contemplate the issuance of public bonds to finance that. However, we've come up with a framework that we feel we can look the public and we can look elected officials and city staff members in the eye and make it clear that there's no risk to the city. And the crux of the framework is that the incremental revenues that the city will enjoy from this project, and there are a number of them. There's admissions fees that we contemplate imposing at the event center, potential extension of admissions fees that are currently imposed at Staples Center that would otherwise expire at some point in the future. There will be significant incremental parking revenue the city will enjoy from this project, potential improved operating performance at the convention center, signage revenues, incremental taxes, and some other sources, many of which we've already identified and began to do some estimates on, and Dan will speak a little bit more about that in detail. But the proposal we put forth calls for all of those revenue streams, which we think can be easily identified and measured, to be the source of repayment for the approximately $350 million worth of bonds that the city would issue. We think those revenue streams will cover most and potentially all of the city's debt service on this project. But what we have committed to do and what we're prepared to commit to do is ensure that if there is ever any shortfall, the developer will step in and will cover any gap. So the idea here is the project will essentially be entirely self-financing for the city, and the cost of replacing the West Hall and building some additional parking will be paid for by revenues that the city enjoys from our project. And in the event that there is a shortfall, which we actually are modeling, as Dan will talk about in a minute, we're modeling a potential shortfall. We don't think it's a large one, and it'll be a function of what some of these incremental revenue streams prove to be. The developer is planning on covering that shortfall. We've built it into our financial model, and we understand that at the end of the day, we'll be responsible for that. So Dan can speak a little bit more to the detail of what we're projecting in some of those revenue streams, because we aren't guessing at this. We have some experience at the Staples Center project with a similar framework. It's, the numbers are different and some of the streams are different, but there is an arrangement at Staples Center we've been operating under for the last 13 years that is similar in concept here. There was some city funds that were put towards the Staples Center project, and the arrangement that was reached was one where we ensured that the city's cost of supplying those funds would be covered by the project, and to the extent it wasn't, and there were shortfalls, we have it's called a gap funding agreement, and the developer at Staples Center has been and remains responsible for those shortfalls, and we've lived up to those obligations. So we envision this being very similar in concept, although the numbers and the potential sources of payment may be a little bit different, but the framework here is one that we're borrowing heavily from a project that we think has been very successful. It's been tested and it's worked from our standpoint for the city and for us as the developer, and we think that's a good model.
The model that we had at Staples Center, and as he alluded to, it is proven, and the numbers are different. We're talking about more bond proceeds now than we were then, but it's the same basic framework in that there were city proceeds utilized. There were imposed taxes on tickets, which is the single largest form of repayment. There were incremental parking revenues. There were certain taxes that were pledged to the repayment of those bonds, and it's worked very well. And in fact, early on, this deal was 13 years ago, but early on there actually were some shortfalls in the early years in the late 90s and early 2000 on the debt service and the credits that were generated, and we were making payments for the first several years, and as Ted alluded to, we lived up to all of those obligations. We actually prepaid a large portion of those obligations as well. So, we feel there's a precedent for this structure. It's proven, it works, and I think most importantly, we've demonstrated that we've lived up to our obligations as it relates to paying the shortfall on the debt service. So as Ted alluded to, this transaction is a little bit different. The numbers are larger. We're talking about $300 to $350 million worth of proceeds for the construction of the new hall and for the construction of the two new parking structures on Cherry Street and on Bond Street. Depending on what market conditions are in the bond market and the movement of interest rates, we think that annually this will result in about a $25 million annual debt service obligation. Ted briefly went over what the various credits are towards those streams. The largest one, like in the Staples Center model, is going to be the admissions fee that's imposed on tickets at Farmers Field. We think that that could generate anywhere between $4 and $5 million a year, and will probably be the largest single source of repayment, and that would be a fee that we would impose and we would remit to the city, just like we do at Staples Center. The next largest stream probably comes from the incremental parking revenue, and again, borrowing from the Staples Center model. This is one of the credits that we currently give towards the city bond obligation there in terms of the revenue generated on the convention center lots, which is on Cherry Street and in Venice Garage. In this case, we would be looking to those lots for incremental revenue, as well as the new lots that we will be constructing for the city, that the city will own on Cherry Street and Bond Street, where we anticipate approximately 1,400 additional parking places. So we think there's some significant incremental revenue, probably in the $3 to $4 million range for that. That represents the second largest credit. The next in the list is the result of various incremental new taxes that will be generated by the project, where we will be seeking credit for the payment of those. So they consist of sales taxes, parking taxes, property taxes, utility taxes, business taxes, a number of them. And again, I think the key point here is that these are not CAT taxes that are currently being generated. We are looking to project-specific taxes that are generated. So if you're at Farmers Field enjoying an NFL game and you go to the concession stand and you buy a hot dog and some nachos, there'll be sales taxes paid on that. It'll be those sales taxes, new taxes, that we'll be seeking credit for. And that's sort of the rule of thumb that we'll be using on all of these. It is new taxes, it's incremental taxes, and we would be seeking credit for those towards the debt service obligation. Same to be said for the city share of the property taxes. In all of these cases, I think it's important to point out that we are only seeking credit for the city's share of these taxes. There will be other components, whether it's property taxes or sales taxes, where there'll be the state share and the county share. We are not seeking any type of reinvestment or credit for those taxes. We are only seeking credit for the city share of those taxes. So as Ted alluded to, after taking into account all of these, we are in fact projecting a shortfall on the debt service, probably somewhere in the $6 to $8 million range on an annual basis. And as Ted said, we're prepared to enter into a new gap funding agreement, just like we did with Staples Center on the old gap funding agreement, where the Farmers Field would stand behind and make up any shortfall in the annual debt service. We're hoping it's less than $6 to $8 million, depending on our projections, but based on where we think these revenues are going to be, we think that's about going to be the annual shortfall. And just as the general fund has not been at risk over the last 13 years at Staples Center, and we've made good on all of our obligations there, the same would apply here under this new gap funding obligation, and the general fund would not be at risk here either. Frankly, we think there are a lot of incremental taxes, whether it's TOT or sales taxes that are generated elsewhere outside of Farmers Field and downtown LA and the district and other hotels. We think that the general fund is actually going to be the beneficiary of a lot of those new taxes. So we think actually this is very much a net positive to the general fund. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to, I know we want to talk a little bit more about some of the broader fiscal impacts, so I'll hand it over to Sean D., who can give some more specifics about the other fiscal impacts of